All right, thank you everyone for joining us in today's Courageous Conversation. Today we're talking about equity officers in local government. And the scope for today's discussion really evolves around the challenging initiatives and programs and efforts since organizations are increasingly hiring equity officers. Some of these equity officers come into established departments with budgets and staff, and others are new to the organization and new to the roles themselves. So whether an equity officer is well-versed or new to the work, many of them continue to experience resistance and limited support for their roles. Today's discussion and conversations will be led by Stephen Ruger. Stephen is Deputy City Manager for the City of Rio Rancho, New Mexico, and holds the title of Certified Municipal Clerk. He oversees several departments, including utilities, libraries, fire rescue, IT, the Office of the City Clerk, as well as city management administrative staff. Prior to his post as Deputy City Manager, Steve held positions in local government, financial management, housing authority administration, and served as city clerk for both the City of Rio Rancho and the City of Aurora, Colorado. Steve is a member of ICMA's Institute on Race, Equity, and Inclusion, and he is also a member of ICMA's Chief Equity Officers Cohort. He will be moderating today's session again, and our panelists are Jackie Guzman and Jonathan Butler. Since December of 2018, Jackie has served as the Deputy City Manager at the City of Sunnyvale, California, where she oversees citywide programs and initiatives, including direct oversight of communications divisions and equity, access, and the inclusion initiative. Her previous local government roles include serving as the Deputy City Manager and Assistant to the City Manager, as well as Human Resources Manager, Senior Management Analyst, and Budget Analyst. In 2009, Jackie was selected as an ICMA Management Fellow at the City of San Jose, California. Jackie holds a Master of Public Policy from the University of California, Los Angeles, and also is a member of the ICMA Equity Officer Institute. Jonathan Butler is an equity manager for the City of San Antonio, Texas. He develops and promotes strategies to increase equitable outcomes citywide. Prior to joining the Office of Equity, Jonathan managed the Neighborhood Services and Development Division for the City of Chattanooga, where he expanded affordable housing and neighborhood revitalization opportunities and created leadership training programs for residents. He has been at the front line of racial and social justice issues since his days as a student leader and organizer at Emory University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree. He also earned his Juris Doctorate degree from American University and is a licensed attorney in Georgia and Virginia. Jonathan is also a member of the ICMA Equity Officer Institute. So thank you again to everyone joining us today. And thank you to Steve, Jackie, and Jonathan for participating in today's Courageous Conversation. Steve, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. I think most of you know that this is a subject that has come up nationally, internationally, and certainly through ICMA. And there's a lot of hot and cold on this subject matter. And I hope that today's discussion will help clarify some things and maybe reframe some ways of thinking about DEI initiatives and really get some insight as to what Jonathan and Jackie and myself are doing on our efforts and why we're doing it. So the theme of today is DEI, find out what it means to me. So I'd like you all to think about, what does DEI mean to you? What does equity mean to you? It should mean something to you. It should mean something to every one of us. Equity is something that touches us as individuals, not necessarily specific groups. So let's focus on today. There are certain groups that we need to address because they are shuffled to the bottom sometimes on the hierarchy of social services. But we also all have a role in this, both as a recipient of equity initiatives and both as a participant in them. So city management, it's changing. I just, I started in the field in 2002, and I never thought I would be sitting on a panel for diversity, equity, and inclusion with the national stage through ICMA. So it's a tremendous thing to see us here. And I hope that even those of you who are kind of new to this or a little wary about these initiatives will get some good takeaways from this discussion. I have to emphasize, Laura's introductions. She read our bios, but I'm just humbled to be here with Jonathan and Jackie. They're tremendous, and I think you're going to get a lot of great insight from them. So I'm going to start by just asking both of them some questions. And Jackie, why don't we start with you? And if you could just give us an introduction and your background, and let's find out what DEI means for you.
All right, so I'm going to start way back. I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants. My family came to the U.S. undocumented, and I was the only one that was born here in my family, and the only U.S. citizen. So I come with that perspective of being in a mixed status family. We were very lucky that my family benefited from the '86 amnesty, and that really changed the trajectory of my family. Once everyone was documented, my parents were able to really give us a lot more opportunities. And I think from that perspective, my parents came to this country like many immigrants to try to give us a better life. And we're seeking any opportunity to try to do that. And also in doing so, volunteering in the community. And so it's no surprise that me and my siblings all went into public service, because that's something that was ingrained in us. And giving back is just in our blood, I guess. And so that's kind of why I went into public service. My siblings are all educators, and I am the youngest and needed to forge my own path. And I actually started my career or studied international relations, and then somehow ended up, working for the state on education policy issues, and then ended up in local government, which I fell in love with, because in local government, you can do the policy work, but you can do the implementation work. You can really connect with community and just make such a big impact and see that impact. And equity was definitely not something that I thought I would do. It's something that I've always been passionate about, those issues. But, I started out my career as a budget analyst, and certainly always using the lens of what is best for the community, especially the underserved community, even in that role, and have always sort of taken that perspective in any of the roles that I do, in the policy work that I do, making sure that we are outreaching and listening to community members that traditionally don't come to us. How do we go to them? That's the approach that I've taken in overseeing communications and community outreach efforts as I do my policy work. And so when things started popping up, especially in my community in Sunnyvale, one of the first times that I was acting as city manager, because my city manager was away, there was a hate crime. And it was the person was targeting who they perceived to be a Muslim family. It turns out they weren't even Muslim. They were Indian American. So it really rocked our community, and we needed to do something to bring our community together and say, hate is just, it's not okay. I come in, Sunnyvale is an incredibly diverse community. We have a really large Asian population, somewhat of a smaller Latino population, and we're a majority community. And so, when this conversation around equity and Black Lives Matter came up. There was a demand from our community. We went out, we talked to our community about it, and we decided that we really wanted to create a community where all people have the ability to participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, regardless of race, means, or circumstances of their birth. That is, it is core to our values. It's core to our mission of providing excellent public service, and, just really aligned. And so we could get our council on board with that. We could get our community on board with that. And we're laying the foundation to be able to better serve everybody in our community the way to meet their particular needs. That's really what this work is about. All the other noise, about CRT and all of these things that are controversial, it's all about serving your community and making sure that you are serving especially the most vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Jackie. Jackie is what we call here in New Mexico, muy chingona. So really appreciate that. So Jonathan, let's hear from you. What does DEI mean to you?
Thank you, Steve and Jackie. It's an honor to share the stage with you all. Steve, you were very gracious in your comments towards me, and Laura's always gracious in her introductions. I think, Steve, I will start by thinking about the question in terms of justice. I'm a son of Atlanta. It's impossible to grow up in Atlanta, Georgia, particularly during the time that I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and not think about our connections to the civil rights movement, not think about our rich histories and traditions associated with upward mobility, particularly of Black people. And this thought of justice, though, I thought when I went to law school that I was going to law school, and I thought about this pursuit of justice and what it actually looks like. As I've deepened my commitment and understanding in the work, I'm even more connected to the tensions associated with what justice actually looks like. I have a meandering pathway, if you will, into this work. I started out as a student at Emory University, as Laura stated in my introduction, and I really thought the pathway for me, things that came naturally, Steve, were these ideas of how do we step into the places of advocating for people most in need? How do we advocate for more diversity? How do we ensure we've got voices that are adequately represented at the table? I didn't know years later that that would turn into my life's work. But when I went to law school and I started practicing law, what I recognized in the practice of for me is that my connections were very transactional oriented. They were one-to-one. They weren't systemic change oriented. They weren't policy driven. It was more of one-to-one, client to client servicing in that way. I got connected when President Obama first ran for office, and I started doing voter protection work and volunteering for the campaign, and got this sense that, I wanted to be a part of something larger, something in which I could make transformational change, something in which I could significantly impact the lives of people, particularly those in need, those most in need and those most marginalized in our communities. I got to the city of Chattanooga, Tennessee, by really thinking about ways to solve problems in the affordable housing space. I did a lot of real estate law work, and I had a particular knack for being able to solve problems around problem properties. And I got to Chattanooga to sort of try to use some of those skills that I had learned along the way to see if we could put affordable housing at the forefront of some of our initiatives in city planning and policy. And then how could we, really use things like real estate as mechanisms to be able to put underperforming properties back on the tax rolls and in the hands of our most marginalized residents who really needed affordable housing. Fast forward to some of the work that got me to the city of San Antonio, I really connected with this idea that as a city, we can begin to move equitable outcomes in ways that really impact people's lives. And I interviewed, was being recruited in a process to come to San Antonio, and really connected with what they were attempting to do. And really this idea that we can introduce and move social justice concepts in government to affect outcomes for people is something that's at the heart of sort of my story. If I looked at one seed across the narrative of my story and thinking about justice is that, how can we be much more impactful in reconciling history, the challenges associated with it, the challenges of traditional mistrust in communities, and how can we start building more bridges to better outcomes for people? That's what really drew me to the work, and that's what it means to me. That's what DEI means to me. You know, we can talk about sort of the three meanings of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can contrast equity and equality. That's for another workshop, you all. But these ideas that we can begin to think about who's at the table, who's the participant in collaborative problem solving, who is being welcomed into participation, and then who's represented. You know, and then how are we moving policies, processes, programs, and procedures for the betterment of all people, particularly centering need, and then particularly centering in our community all of the disparity data that says there needs to be an emphasis on racial equity within our community. How can we then move in that direction to do things that are going to be ultimately impactful for everyone in our community?
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Both great stories. I wanted to share a little bit about what I'm doing in Rio Rancho as well. And if you guys have not heard of San Antonio, it has what, like 20,000 people at this point? Just kidding. Very big city. So
1.6 now, based on the new census, Steve.
Wow. So you're reaching a very broad spectrum of people and important work. Jackie, how big is your community?
We're about 150,000.
150. Okay, so Rio Rancho is the smallest. We're about 104,000, but we are also the fastest growing in the state of New Mexico, and we're excited for that. So Rio Rancho is a very diverse city. We're actually about 42% Hispanic. We have 5% of our population who are non-foreign born nationals. So, and I could go on more stats, but once I started looking at our population demographics, it became very clear that we have very diverse needs. We have everything from poverty level to very affluent residents. So I came back as deputy city manager from Aurora, Colorado, being city clerk up there in August of 2020, last year. And one of the things I wanted to bring was a DEI initiative and focus, as Jackie was saying, on equity. How do we ensure that our staff is treating our residents equitably? And particularly, we all have personal biases, and we all need to think about what those are. And that's not my goal. It's not my goal to change the minds of our staff members. Maybe that's an ancillary goal, but it is my goal as an administrator to ensure that they operate without those biases in their service delivery. You can't not prioritize a call for an ambulance because you don't agree with someone's religion, or you don't like their race, or you don't like their sexual identity. So those are the types of things where, you know, it could even be a subconscious thing, but I want us to actively think about how we're performing our service and prioritizing our residents' needs in an equitable way. So just some personal things for me, similar to Jackie, I'm newish to DEI, but it's something that's been a passion of mine for an awful long time. I started out in undergrad at Wichita State having no idea what I wanted to do. And I took a social inequality class, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. I later pursued a undergraduate degree in sociology. I wanted to do something more participatory than market research and that type of thing. So I pursued a master's in public administration from the University of Kansas. A lot of you probably know they have a local government focus, and I've joined the local government crew and never looked back. Local is where it's happening. Local is where I feel like we can make the biggest impact. And that's why this work is so important. So I've been discriminated against personally. I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And throughout my life and throughout my career, it has popped up in negative ways and both positive ways too. So I know what it's like to be discriminated against personally. That's my personal story. But really where I started getting a huge interest in this was when I was city clerk of Aurora. I'm sure most of you have heard of Elijah McClain and are familiar with the circumstances that happened surrounding that young man's death. Very bad decision-making. And we ended up boarding up the windows at City Hall. We ended up having a protest that escalated to some level of violence as well. Aurora's police department prior to that time was heralded for their response to the theater shooting in 2012. And it took one bad decision and one bad act to change the entire viewpoint of that police force in that community. So as city managers, we need to recognize any of our community is vulnerable. Any of our communities are vulnerable to a single act casting a negative shadow. And so sometimes I get asked, well, is your DEI initiative in reaction to something that happened? Absolutely not. It's a preventative thing. It's more, I would like to be on the side of the coin if something does happen to say, you know, this doesn't align with our values. This doesn't align with how we operate as a city, and already have established protocols and already have established processes for when these things happen. Again, we're all vulnerable. I think we should all think when, not if, something major that affects how our community views us from an equity standpoint might happen in our community. So that's my story. That's how I got into it. It's something I'm very passionate about. And tying that into city management is something that's very fascinating to me. It's very, very prime right now. I think if anything, our country's become a lot more divisive over the last several years. And so now is the time to be having these conversations. I think that different opinions have been exposed on a lot of different subjects, and we need to embrace that. And we need to not shy away from these types of courageous conversations. And we need to be to the fore on addressing these things head on. So that's my story, but I would like to hear from Jackie and Jonathan. We'll start with Jonathan this time. Tell us about what's going on in San Antonio. Tell us what your community looks like and some of the projects and the scope that you're working on and what you're seeing directly in your field.
Great, thank you, Steve. As I mentioned earlier, we're a city of 1.6 million people. We have 13,000 city employees. We have about 40 city departments. Our work is citywide. It's primarily internal in nature, where our belief is we've got some things that we have to focus on within our own house to ensure that we are doing things in manners that make us better service providers. The idea then is that in turn translates into better services and more equitable results within departments. We are a small but mighty team of 4 right now. Our former chief equity officer has moved on to greener pastures, and so we're in a process right now of even hiring another equity manager. The idea is that we split our departments up amongst the equity managers to service, and we provide technical assistance directly to those departments. We also provide a host of services, a host of platforms. We have a host of tools that we have made available to the city in whole. Those tools, for example, are being used to implement allocations in our bond program. It's a $3 billion bond program. We've used a tool that we created to think about distributions in ARPA monies and Recovery Act funds in our COVID response. to try to prioritize decision-making based again on need. If I gave my spiel about how we sort of organize our work, we think about awareness being capacity building. We have a train-the-trainer program in which we've trained now over 100 city employees representing almost all of our departments, who are then our equity champions within those departments to go and provide training on a curriculum that we've designed. We've designed an equity curriculum that operates in 3 parts. The first part is an introductory type of content. The second is really a deeper dive into institutional and structural racism. And then the third is direct, how do you operationalize and how do you apply this work specifically within your departments? Now, because we liaise individually with departments, we're already moving that work in some ways, and we organize around a citywide equity committee that's made up of at least one member of each department. We usually have about 2 persons from each department that really serve as our policy think tank. These are the type of groups that are coming from everything from changes to our dress code policies, changes to ways in which we connect and identify with everything from gender identification, sexual orientation, all user restrooms, all of those types of things are coming out of this think tank, if you will, based on all of these members of the city, various departments who are represented on the citywide equity committee. And then if I were to say and shift in terms of sort of our platforms around tools, we are in processes where we are doing equity action plans and department equity assessments. The idea is that we will get through all of our departments. We've just finished our first 5 departments, which include human resources, neighborhood and housing services, economic development, to name a few. And the idea is that these departments will then produce 2-year equity action plans. And then we've got a host of tools. We've got a budget equity tool. We've got an equity atlas in which we are overlaying race and income data. Education has been added now. We also overlay traditional red-lined areas so that people can identify and connect with economic disinvestment in particular areas, and we can track trends over time. And then we have, to round us out, if you will, in terms of our tools, I've mentioned our rapid response toolkits. We've also created a racial equity indicator report that really highlights significant areas of disparities. So we've done a lot in a very short period of time. And as I know Jackie will talk about perhaps a little bit, it takes people to do this work. So for entities that are really serious about investing, you've got to make the investment in people to be able to move the work. You've got to make the investment in being able to understand data and be able to process and mine it and get it and gather it, all of those things in order to really tailor your problem solving towards those most in need. The last thing I'll say, Steve, demographically, we are a community that is about 67% identifies as Latinx or Hispanic. We are a majority minority community there. And some of the challenges that are significant throughout the country, particularly as I alluded to with racial equity, we still have challenges with here. Our African-American population, for example, is about 7%. But when we overlay all of the economic data associated with income disparities, when we overlay health disparities, when we overlay housing disparities, the impact still is significant in terms of racial categories. And so race is still an indicator of success, unfortunately, in our community. And zip codes in areas of town are still determiners of people's success and outcomes. We are an extremely racially segregated city. our traditional communities of our East Side, representing our traditional African-American community, of our South and West Side, representing our most prominent Latinx communities. Still, all of the economic indicators, health outcomes, as I talked about, housing outcomes, still largely based on race and racial disparities. That just gives you a snapshot of what we're working on here in San Antonio.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do you guys also track voter data by area?
We have not.
Yeah, that's something the city and county of Denver has started doing by precinct. They track individually the number of votes, and then they match that up with their demographics. And it's very fascinating to see who has the stronger voice in the community as well when it comes to electing local leaders. So fascinating stuff. Thank you, Jonathan. Jackie, can you tell us what's going on in your community? What's happening in Sunnyvale?
Sure. First of all, if anyone on the call is like, wow, San Antonio is amazing and I am woefully inadequate, you're not alone. That's how I feel. It's like San Antonio is the goal. And don't feel bad if you're not even close to that, because, you know, when I was first asked to be on this panel, I was like, I'm in the beginning stages. I'm not an expert. You want somebody who has much more experience. And the message was, no, a lot of people are feeling like, what do I do? How do I get started on this work? And really that's where I'm at. This is a small portion of what I do. And to Jonathan's point, it takes a lot of staff time and resources. And so when we launched our initiative, which we did in July of this year. So we're in the beginning stages. We kind of formalized our equity, access, and inclusion initiative. And we decided there's different approaches that you can take to do this. In Sunnyvale, we decided we had done listening sessions, but that was, you know, not necessarily part of a formal initiative. We decided that we needed to lay the foundation and really learn about what this work means internally and get some internal training and infrastructure before we really launched into more of you know, an external program. And so what we have been doing in Sunnyvale is we started with recruiting an internal equity team, which we call SEED, Sunnyvale Employees for Equity and Diversity. And so our SEED team started meeting in September. We did have a competitive process. So we had an application process. We had no idea who was going to apply, if we would even have enough people. And it was great. We had a lot of interest from employees. We have at least one representative from each department. I think that's really important. Jonathan talked about the same thing, having that representation from all departments. And we are kind of following that model that we've seen in other cities of these are we're training them up, because of course, none of us come with expertise, and that's okay. We're all learning as we go. So we're training up our team on these concepts. We really started with having some personal connection too, because I think this work can be very personal, and you need to come in with it with vulnerability. And so we started doing some team building and also training. And where we're at right now is we're looking at different frameworks. We're trying to develop an equity framework that's really kind of a one-page snapshot about what it is that we are trying to accomplish, that we can share internally with all of our staff, with our council, and eventually with our community. We're also starting to you know, we want to eventually create an action plan, but in order to do that, you have to know where you're at. And so we've divided into two teams. One team is looking at the history of social inequality in Sunnyvale. So, you know, what are the different policies that have created disparities in Sunnyvale? You know, and we're in Silicon Valley. So we used to be orchards. We used to be completely agricultural. What I know from our history is we had a lot of Latino and Asian, families that worked in agriculture, and many of our Japanese American landowners were interred and their lands were taken away. That's part of our history. And we're looking at, what impact has that had? The second group is really looking at that disparity data. So looking at what are the different disparities based on race and ethnicity, based on geography. What's really interesting about Sunnyvale, unlike San Antonio, is we're a very integrated community. We don't have pockets of, Asian or Latino. We have pockets of single family, wealthier areas, and largely Sunnyvale is a wealthy community, very tech centric, but we do also have pockets where we have mobile home communities that are more of our affordable areas. And so, and certain parts of the city have more socioeconomic challenges than others. And so we're trying to dig into that data and seeing, if we can glean anything from this research, so then it can inform how we're going to approach equity issues. Because again, it's all about outcomes. How do we start really understanding where the disparities are so that we can target them and meet the needs of our community members? What we do know, and we don't need research to tell us this, we know where the loudest voices come from. To your point, Stephen, I can look at the census data. We're going through redistricting now. I know who comes to our redistricting meetings, who, where the voter constant. We also have a large immigrant community. So what's interesting here is we have an affluent immigrant community, but not all of them are citizens and not all of them can vote, right? But they still should have a voice in how we manage our local resources. So we know that when we dig into the data, we're going to find some disparities, and it's going to be very interesting to see where that takes us. And oftentimes I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm lucky that I'm connected to the Equity Officer Institute so that I can learn so much from my colleagues doing this work. But I also know that even though I don't feel like I'm expert and I'm learning as I go, something needs to be done. So I'm doing something. And I'm glad that I have, a team right now of equity champions on our seed team that are, we're all working together to try to forge this path. I'm also lucky that, we did realize this is a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of effort, and we really do need somebody to focus on it. So our council did approve an equity manager position. Right now it's a 2-year limited term position. I'm hoping that it'll become permanent, but we have to prove that this work is meaningful and that we need it. So that's my goal, is to make sure that we can have some good, meaty outcomes that can justify this important work and the need to really budget resources for it.
I think, Jackie, to your point, we're all learners. This field continues to evolve. So when I started as a college student, in the days immediately post affirmative action, we were talking about this work in terms of multiculturalism. It then shifted to polyculturalism, then diversity, and the different evolutions and the constant movement in this domain, I think is apparent. And to your point about making the investment, I think people also have to understand something about the differences between ensuring, yes, that we have some quantitative results, but there need to be some emphasis on qualitative results as well, right? Changing people's lives for the better, making sure that people feel more comfortable in the workforce, making sure that people can show up as their authentic selves, making sure that we have normalized the cultures of talking about pronouns and ways in which people choose to identify. All of those things have constantly evolved. And I think over the last couple of years, we've reached some new ways of being able to introduce this stuff. But now we also see a receding of that. We see a lot of pushback, right? So even in all of the great work we've been able to do over the last couple of years, particularly here in San Antonio, and the reason I'm listening to you all, I'm saying over the last couple of years, it's really through my involvement in our evolution of our office. Our office started out as a diversity office. It came to be known as an office of equity only 4 years ago. And then this incarnation of it under its second, well, really third chief equity officer. If you think about it, in 4 years, 3 different chief equity officers, we're about to go into our 4th. There's still a lot of change, a lot of fluidity in what's happening. So I just wanted to give you some voice in that sense, that we're all still learning in this process as well.
And the other thing I want to just really emphasize is, we're talking about an office or an equity team, but really when we launched this initiative, we were very clear with our organization that this is not a program that's going to be driven by a small group of people. This work is about culture change, about organizational change, and fundamentally about how we do our work differently to have better outcomes for everybody. So, it takes everybody has to be involved and on board. And like Stephen said, whether you have your own biases or not, as public servants, you are obligated to provide excellent service to any resident in your city. And that's what this is about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jackie and Jonathan. And you guys are alluding to something we discussed yesterday in the Chief Equity Officers cohort, which I'm passionate about. This is not an event. This is a process. As city managers and administrators, sometimes we think of things as project-based. Okay, this is a one and done. We'll do this and move on. There's no moving on this. This is something that I think we need to be mindful of going forward. And I like what Jackie said about culture change. It does come with a bit of a culture change. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes people react in different ways, and all of that is okay. But these conversations do need to happen. So I just wanted to quickly highlight what Rio Rancho is doing, just so you get a third perspective. We are not probably in a position anytime soon to hire a chief equity officer or anything like that. So we're one of the cities that is doing this all on a volunteer basis, but I can't emphasize enough the points that Jackie and Jonathan made about building a team, and it needs to be cross-departmental. So I could, as a deputy city manager or a city manager, a chief equity officer, assistant city manager, whoever, any one of us individually could sit down and issue a directive. We could sit down and draft an admin policy. I just don't feel like that's an equitable approach to this type of thing. You really need the voice of other people in your organization to accomplish, anything that you would like to have as an outcome. So I built a team with a representative from each of our departments. We have 13 of them, and a couple departments sent 2 people, which I was fine with. I would encourage you, if you do want to build a team to help you with an effort like this, think about how you're going to evaluate those team members. How do you it's easy to handpick people and say, well, she's Black, so of course she should be on the DEI committee. I would absolutely caution against that. I would suggest have people write an essay. We had one person that applied to be on the team, and he's just a normal everyday white guy. And he happened to grow up with a Black brother who was adopted and had a very powerful story about how he grew up in an environment witnessing firsthand how he was actively treated differently than his brother was. And so it was a very important component, and it added so much value to our team. So quickly, I just wanted to say where Rio Rancho's at. We assembled our team in January. And then we've gotten to the point where we have 3 goals and some strategies that come from those goals, which we have presented to our city council. And I just want to read you what our 3 goal statements are. So the first goal is we will strive to ensure that employees consciously remove bias when interacting with each other and our residents. I think we don't want to forget about the each other part. Our residents are certainly important, but we also need to make sure that we are operating in an equitable manner amongst each other and we're not discriminating each other. Promotions need to be based on merit, not on discriminating factors, for example. Our second goal, we will commit ongoing resources to create and sustain a culture among employees that promotes awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's easier said than done. Who commits resources to a local government? It's elected officials. So you really have to have their buy-in, and you have to gauge what level of commitment they're going to have to support these programs. And it's our job to convince them of the importance of these types of things. And then the last goal statement that we came up with, which was a surprise to me, and it's something I wouldn't have come up with on my own. And that's why this is a good example of where the team and the group work really matters. We'll provide a safe process to address employee concerns related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Come to find out, HR is not always viewed as the most friendly department in an organization. They're the people who hire and fire people. And we had some powerful stories about people who felt they had been actively discriminated against, but were too uncomfortable to go to HR because they didn't want formal action being taken. They didn't want backlash. They didn't want retaliation. And it's unfortunate they had that view, but it's our job, I think, to ensure that we provide a safe mechanism for our employees to address these concerns. So we're working through those 3 goals, and we have some strategies that go with those. I won't get into those, but that's kind of where we're at. Now, we have, last summer, we had some BLM demonstrations, and then we had counter protesters that came as well. So in sleepy little Rio Rancho, where not much action usually happens, these issues are starting to touch us on a very national headline stage in terms of what we're seeing nationally. The last thing I'll say is I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are experiencing a hard time hiring people right now. Younger generations, just my perspective and just the research I've read, they're looking for organizations that support differences. They're looking for organizations that have values that support alternative lifestyles, that embrace racial equity. They want those things. They're screaming for those. The private sector is doing a very good job in most cases on those and having core tenets. They have a lot of programs that have awesome names. Some of them, and I won't get into those, but acronyms that just really support their robust programs that they've implemented, and they're living and breathing these things. And I think in the public sector, we're a little behind on these types of things. So from a recruitment standpoint alone, I would challenge you to think about what is someone applying to your organization looking for, and what matters to them in terms of how they're treated. And even if they're not per se a minority or an impoverished group or something like that, they still may have some strong opinions on how they want to be treated. The classic example I use here in Rio Rancho is a common question to ask a resident here is, what church do you go to? We have a very religious community. And even among different religions, I see discrimination. Even among like-minded groups in the Black communities, I've heard people say, hey, you're not Black enough. For whatever reason, or you're not Hispanic enough, or you're white, you should act this way. Those things still come up. And so we have a lot of dissension even among what we would perceive as like-minded groups. So that's why the subject of this for me is find out what it means to me. I think we need to challenge ourselves to look at this as an individualistic approach. And I love what Jackie said. It is our duty to ensure that we treat every member of the public, and I'd add in all of our employees, equitably and without discrimination. So thank you all for your comments on that. We have a couple more things that I want the panel to discuss, and then we'll open it up for some questions from our viewers. But so I guess we've alluded to it, but I want to be a little bit more poignant. And Jackie, I'm going to start with you. Why do Why should local government leaders pursue equity initiatives? Why is this important?
I think as public servants, we have the task of doing the public good, right? Collecting taxes and resources and distributing them, right? And if we are not distributing our resources in a fair and equitable manner, then we are losing our public trust, right? We cannot just listen to the voices that come to our council meetings. We have to do a better job of going out and going where people are at and really understanding where the needs are and allocating our resources in a fair manner to better meet the needs of our community, because we are only as successful as our most vulnerable community members are. I mean, the whole work is about bettering the entire community, and you can't do that unless you are addressing the needs of the communities that have most need. And that, I mean, when we're talking to elected officials in Sunnyvale, it's different because we're a very progressive town in a very progressive region. And, you know, everybody here has sort of drank the Kool-Aid. What happens though is, you know, do people really understand what this work is about when the rubber meets the road? When we're going to be telling our council, we can't just fix the potholes in the sidewalks on a complaint basis, because when we do that, we know that we're fixing the potholes in the wealthiest areas, because those are the ones that know how to complain. And we need to do this differently so that we are not perpetuating inequities, right? So what's going to happen when the rubber meets the road? And it's really trying to really to frame it in a way that is not, you know, about all of this national controversy that's happening, that's creating a lot of animosity. You have to take it back to just being a good steward of community resources, being responsive. These are all things that are part of the core values of a public servant, and taking it back to that.
Thanks, Jackie. The analogy I always use for what you're describing is schools. I firmly believe, and I vote for all school bond questions. I don't have kids. I don't have kids in school, but I really believe that the quality of schools directly impacts the quality of the community. So I want our kids to be educated. I want them to have the resources they need, because I think it makes the entire society better. So that I know there's some people that say, well, I don't have kids to go to school. Why should I pay for other kids? And I always firmly believe it's because there's a direct benefit to you in keeping kids educated and contributing to the society. Jonathan, let's hear from you. Why do you think this is so important? What is the role of local government leaders in this?
You asked me, why is it important? Where do you want me to start? How much time you got, Steve? I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I think I'll just frame my remarks in this way. I think there's both a moral and an economic imperative. The moral concept of what type of community do we want to be? Do we want to be a community that ensures everyone has an opportunity to be able to participate in community, in well-being, in happiness, and all of those things, right? With fair and reasonable opportunities to compete. History also tells us that government has had a significant role in helping to create many of the disparities that exist, right? So government sanctioned policies have been a part of creating some of the divides in our country, right? And some of the divides in outcomes. So my sense then is that who is best equipped then to dismantle and eradicate a lot of the challenges, then it has to be with government, right? We have to sort of examine ourselves as public servants to be able to say, hey, we can account for the histories and the challenges associated with it and create policies, programs, platforms that provide greater opportunities to dismantle some of the things that we did, but also allow for more opportunities to succeed. That leads into that economic imperative. That economic imperative is this: if we have fair opportunities for people to be prosperous in the society, it's going to benefit everybody. It's going to particularly benefit us from an economic base, from a tax base, from paying people honest and living wages for honest work is a thing, right? People should not have to work full-time jobs and continue to live in poverty, right? So then what's the idea? Are we going to promote systems that continue to cycle continuous generational poverty, right? By simply not paying people an honest wage, right? A fair wage for work, right? I referenced the civil rights movement previously. Many people forget that the March on Washington was really about jobs. It was a march for jobs and equality from that standpoint. And what they were advocating, Steve, is the same thing we're advocating now, like $15 an hour living wage, right? If you go back to the 60s when the march took place and you compare the numbers to today, it's the same amount, right? And so I think that economic imperative that makes all of our cities better, it then allows us more opportunities for more resources to invest in roads and infrastructure and buildings and housing, and allows us to do more with planning and making sure that our built environment can then live up to the imagination of the people that it's representing. So I think it's both a moral and economic imperative, and that's just my sort of 10-minute sound bite version of it. But I can go on and talk about this for another hour and a half.
I love that, Jonathan. And I have an analogy that I use in my trainings, and I firmly believe this, that I'd like to share with the group. And that'll be my comments on this subject is, I'm a classically trained saxophone player, and yes, that is a thing. And I play with a pro-level wind ensemble in Santa Fe. And we have people in that group who are physicists at Los Alamos Labs. We have people in that group that are hippies that live off the grid in Taos. We have every religion you can imagine. We have Hispanic people, we have Black people, we have white people, all kinds of different people. There are people that I would never want to talk to. There are people that scare me and intimidate me. There are people that I would never go get a beer with. There are people I love and value as family members. All of that aside, when the downbeat happens, it's our job to play effectively with each other as musicians and create a beautiful product. And that's what I envision for DEI initiatives. We don't have to agree. We don't have to like each other. We don't have to get along. But when the downbeat happens, we should all be there to do our part to make a beautiful product together. And that's just kind of how I approach these things. And that's kind of my vision. So the last thing, we have one more question that I want to ask the panel because it's super important. And I think it's really apropos for what's happening right now in local government. And then we have about a half hour left, but I do want to be able to take some questions. There's some great things in the chat. I'm not going to read them, but I would encourage you to take a look at the chat. Some great quotes, some great resources. So thank you for posting those. But the last question is, and I'm going to actually look at my notes because I want to get it right because it's that important. How do we work with our elected officials to ensure a balance of their priorities while striving to operate equitably and inclusive? There are some councils and commissions, aldermen, whatever they're called, that flat out are going to tell their managers or their administrators, we are never doing this. How do you balance that? What do you do? So I'd like to open that up to Jonathan first. How do you work with elected officials that may not yet be on board with these types of initiatives, or may flat out actively not want them or think that they're not worthwhile?
That's an interesting question, and I can answer that in 100 different ways too, Steve.
Yep.
But one of the things that instantly came to mind is you're going to pay for it one way or another, right? Either you invest in people and invest in their opportunities for success, or you place your investments in prisons, as we've seen in prison pipelines, particularly promulgated where people of color are adversely affected, right? You pay for it in a lot of the tribalism that's happening throughout our country. You pay for it in a lot of hate and animus for people. You're going to pay for it one way or another, right? It's going to affect you economically one way or another, right? And so my sense, though, in also working with people is I think it's sometimes easier for people to understand arguments when they have data, right? So I think data is important. Number two, I think it's easier to talk about need. I'm just being real. I think it's easier to talk about need. And to center, say, hey, you know, it does make sense that my mom used to say it to me this way. She used to say, hey, you and your brother, I didn't do X, Y, and Z with you because you didn't need that. You and your brother needed different things, right? So we need to apply problem solving and solutions that merit the attempt to solve the problem of the thing, right? As opposed to trying to tailor make everything to fit everything. You can't do it and be successful. So my sense is if you think about, well, in District 8, you may need different things than you need in District 1, right? So how do we center that need and the people who are most affected at the center of decision making? These are some of the conversations I think that I would have with elected officials and lawmakers, and understand that, listen, you know, until we get this right, our community is not going to ever be as prosperous as we want it to be.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jackie, how about you? Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Jonathan about centering the need. And, you know, I think you have to meet people where they're at. And there's certain council members that you can be more candid with, and you could talk about racial disparities in a more, you know, the way that we're talking about it here with each other. And with others, you're not even going to be able to mention race, right? But it is still about the need. And so you might need to make a socioeconomic argument about what the needs are, even though you know underlying that it is about race. I mean, racial disparities, when you look at the data, that's really what predominantly is driving a lot of this. But if you start talking about, you know, white supremacy or structural racism, they're just going to shut down, right? You need to be strategic about how you frame this based on, you know, that individual council members' understanding of why they got into elected office, what is important to them, you know, and how do you frame this work in a way that's going to resonate with them? And the same thing with your community. Every community is different, but it's going to be really hard for people to argue that we want to create a society where people have the ability to participate and prosper, reach that potential, create economic opportunities, regardless of, you know, the different identities that they carry. That's very difficult to argue against, right? So it's about framing it depending on, you know, the priorities and values of your community and your specific elected leaders. That's all I'll say about that is really be strategic about that and really try to tailor your message based on what's going to resonate with them.
And Jackie,
I think,
go ahead, Jonathan, please.
yeah, Steve, to Jackie's point, there also has to be a recognition that the market can't regulate everything. The market can't solve all of our problems, right? So there are things like natural disasters that just recently happened across our country, right? Where when the market can't solve the problems, it's incumbent upon government to intervene. And so this idea then that we can't do the same thing when it comes to the everyday lives and challenges of people it's really short-sighted to me. When we do it all the time, if we step in emergency situations and we have to exact some types of measures, right? I think if we had that type of thought process towards everything, this is the role of government. This is the role of public servants in particular, to intervene where the market can't completely regulate activity, behaviors, and the market doesn't act from a moral compass, right? They only think about the bottom line. And the role of government, as I think Cynthia was writing in the chat, is to think about that. What kind of community we want to be.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And I think Rio Rancho is kind of an amalgam of what you're both talking about. We, for the most part, our council is not embracing these types of initiatives. So it's my job to challenge that. But I would tie it back to Jonathan's comment on getting as much data as possible. Find out what it means to each of your elected officials. Understand where they're coming from. Understand why they might be opposed to some of these initiatives, or why they might be for some of these initiatives. And then you can make a holistic plan as to what the best approach is. As Jackie alluded to, in Rio Rancho, it would have not worked for me to lead with race, which is sad, but it's also a reality. So I had to take a different approach. And so I think knowing your audience and understanding them is key in these types of initiatives. Clifford Armstrong put a great comment in the chat. There are legal limits of what we can do too. And there are penalties for not adhering to legal standards. And certainly beyond legal standards, there's like the Elijah McClain incident. There is public perception as well that can wreak havoc, not only from a political standpoint and a trust standpoint, but from a financial standpoint. There's a lot of money that goes into the aftermath of a very bad discriminatory event happening in your community that's not well received on a local or a national stage. So I would keep that in mind too. If you need more reasons, I'm sure Jonathan can give you his 150 plus, Jackie could give you hers, and I could give you mine. But in the interest of time, I want to move on and see if we have questions from our participants. But a couple of quick housekeeping things before we do that. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being on the call. I think you're courageous for being on this and listening to us speak. And I truly hope you get some value out of this and some perspective. And we're three human beings trying to do the best we can. And I really, we're your peers. We're not any better than you. We're just trying to figure out things like all of you all are. So, your comments and questions are very welcomed. But I wanted to read one quote. Jonathan mentioned that we're not talking about what equality is versus equity, and I agree. That's something that we could put into an entire session. But Paula Dressel from the Race Matters Institute has a tremendous quote that is so apropos for local government, and I just would be remiss not to share it with you all. Just going to read it to you. The route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally. Powerful stuff, right? It will be achieved by treating everyone justly according to their circumstances. I love that. I think that is a tremendous approach for local government, not just from a DEI standpoint, but just from a general basic service delivery standpoint. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Laura, and maybe Laura, you can help me with how to facilitate questions from the panel.
Absolutely. Such a wonderful, rich discussion. I've made a lot of notes myself. One question that popped into the chat a little early on that I think would be great if we can discuss, but it says we must acknowledge high turnover of the equity officers, which is due to a lack of support, symbolism, etc. How do we address this across the country?
Well, and I want to start on that one, but I definitely want Jonathan and Jackie to comment. In our chief equity officers cohort, we had a great discussion about how often minorities are hand-plucked to be chief equity officers because they are minority. I think sometimes there's an assumption, oh, you're Hispanic, you're Black, you're gay. So certainly you know everything about DEI. I think that's a very false approach. And I think some of the turnover stems from that. You're placing the wrong people in the position. So I would say vet the people very well. But the other thing I'll say, and I'm sure Jonathan and Jackie have some thoughts on this too, it's not an easy job. It's really hard. You have to be brave. It's mentally taxing. You'll do presentations to people who philosophically disagree with everything you're saying, and you go home and just want to have more than a glass of wine, let's put it that way. So that's my perception. But Jackie, why don't we start with you? What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, first of all, I'll say it was hard even to recruit an equity manager because there's just such a huge need, and everybody is starting to recruit equity managers, and it's kind of a new field, especially in local government. So it's hard to attract somebody in general, and especially to compete with the private sector, which, you know, compensates much more than we can. And, you know, good people get recruited. And also it's hard work. And if you don't have the support from the top to do this work, then you're going to get burned out. So I think that as we're hiring these positions, and, you know, I'm thinking about this now, it's about how do I create the supportive environment and also the buffer when things get hard, to make sure that I'm not overburdening this manager that's going to be coming in. I need to work on how to be, as an executive in the city, a really good champion, and also, you know, keeping my colleagues, you know, who are directors, you know, checking them and making sure that from the top, I'm making sure that my city manager is fully on board and communicating and using him to make sure that the organization knows that this is a very important priority for the organization. It's a priority for a council, and it is not this side project. And I've already had to do that, actually, because there was a director that told one of my seed team members that this was not a priority and that they needed to finish certain tasks before they came to our meeting. And, you know, when I did my I do an update with my executive leadership team about what we're doing. I specifically talked to my city manager and told him, I need you to step in and remind the directors that this is a priority. This is not a side project. This is an essential part of our seed team's duties. And they have to prioritize this work. And so, but if, you know, it's really hard. If you don't have that support, then your DEI manager is just going to get burned out and say, it's not worth it. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this work in this environment that's not supportive? I'm hitting walls left and right. You're going to lose them. You're going to hit walls, and people are going to say, I'm going to go to a community that is more open to this, right? So, you know, you really need to get your executive team on top, especially your city manager.
Jonathan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think even the most supportive institutions still fall prey to tokenism, cronyism, symbolism, you name it. Even within all of the good work that we've been able to do here in San Antonio, we still have our challenges. Even people with sometimes the best intentions can unintentionally make decisions that hinder your abilities to be successful. That's the nature of the beast, unfortunately, right? We've been lucky to have an extremely supportive city manager, extremely progressive and proactive city council and mayor who have been champions of the work. Some of our biggest challenges have been within department leadership that is either resistant or, you know, not an outward objector, but they don't allow the investment of time from staff for example. They don't look at resource allocation, or they don't look at sort of some of the advice and recommendation that we might offer as things that they really should look at and analyze, right? And so we used to have a saying when about a year from me into the job, we come back into the office after having some particularly difficult but necessary conversations and say, hey, nobody got fired today. That's a win, right? And so some of the idea that the nature of some of this work is to push, is to challenge. You definitely have to have people who understand that enough to give you enough leeway, to give you some autonomy, to give you some ability to be able to do some of the things that you hope will actually make a difference and impact your community. I can't underscore enough what Jackie's talking about. You need commitment, you need buy-in, you need resources, and you need people who understand that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And so as much as I feel like equity officers are placed with the unfair burden of showing some mechanisms of productivity that in large part may be borrowed from some more nonprofit-based organizations than even private entities, that willingness to understand that, look, you know, a large part of what we have to do is we have to know enough about the people that we're serving, understand enough about the people that we're serving before we can really do anything that's going to be tantamount to success. And so that necessity for some patience as we try to build out successful entities is also something that I think leadership needs to understand.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just wanted to give a Rubio in the chat a shout out for your welcome, and good luck on your master's. And hopefully you'll choose local government as your career. We do have a hand raised from Rolando Cuevas. Go ahead, Rolando. What's your question?
Hello. Thank you. First, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about DEI and representation today. And it's funny because my parents are also Mexican immigrants and also benefited from the same policy that Jacqueline was talking about. And I also studied international relations and I want to work in local government. So it's very kind of a meta situation to see you here today. This is the first time it's probably happened to me. So thank you for being that role model. And for Stephen, I do want to say that I'm actually one of those young people that you were mentioning about looking for positions in local government, that really looking for places that focus on this type of work. I'm currently getting my master's right now as well in public administration. And this is, and not just for me, but for so many people in my cohort, this is like the main thing we talk about all the time now that we're applying for jobs that we're going to graduate, is that we're all really looking through different cities and different state governments and seeing who's taking this work seriously. And I think for a lot of us, it's really the big challenge in terms of, you know, deciding on where we want to work after this. To me personally, talking about what DEI means in racial equity, I think racial equity work is about accountability. And it's not just about representation and coming to the table, but it's really about using the levers of policy to address racial inequalities. I'm really a firm believer that, like, government, as kind of Jonathan, you mentioned, created so many of our racial equity disparities. So it's going to take government to solve them. An inspirational model for me has been DC's Council of Racial Equity and their approach to racial equity impact assessments that they provide for every council policy that's announced. They have a really strong team of 5, and they provide an analysis within 10 days that kind of says if the policy will be status quo, will exacerbate racial inequality, or will kind of benefit in terms of narrowing racial inequalities, which is like a very transparent, I don't know, I'm a very big fan of like their website and their approach. So with that, I wanted to ask, in terms of, you know, many of the DI efforts that were discussed today revolved around bias, representation, and data collection. But I'm wondering what appetite in your city, what if there's an appetite in your cities for a more policy-centered approaches to addressing systemic racism, such as kind of DC's model. Thank you.
Yeah. Jonathan, you unmuted first. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for your question, and thank you for your interest in public service. That's the idea. What we are attempting to do is culture change, both through the behaviors of people and individuals, but also the institution, right? And the ways in which we hope to do that is through extensive policy changes that really do change the way in which we're doing business and improve the way we're doing business. And so some of the direct work that we do with the departments is with that in mind. And so let me just give you an example. When we thought about the allocation of resources for something like pandemic response, right? What we received data on very early is that some of the hardest hit businesses were in our most challenged, lower income, low investment areas. And so what are we doing then? What are we going to do to ensure that folks have pathways to be able to navigate and get through the pandemic? How are we then steering resources in that direction? How do we prioritize the steering of resources in that direction? And then what are we doing with it, right? And so one of the things that we came up with is we see certain sectors of community are being forced out of work. You've got large portions of community that don't have the ability to work from home. And so what do? Let's put our personal protective equipment allocations and resources into those folks who are less likely to be able to have that support. What about those who are less likely to be able to apply for grant funding to be able to offset some of these things? And so we have a system that we design in which we prioritize ensuring that businesses located in high concentrations of low income areas and communities of color were prioritized in resource distribution and allocation. That's just an example of how we're attempting to change the way we do policy to ensure that we've got results that are more impactful for community. We've had sort of these first come, first serve types of allocations of resources. How do we flip that and start prioritizing need first? And then drill through sort of your rubric to make the determinations of resource allocation. That's just one example of how we're using policy and we're thinking through policy to change the script on how we apply more equitable outcomes.
Jonathan, does San Antonio have a DEI related administrative policy?
So we have what we call administrative directives.
Okay.
And those administrative directives really govern everything from public engagement, language access, surveys. I mentioned dress codes earlier. Anything you can think about within the span of the scope of the workforce and how we are targeting departments to address certain things. So what we have done is been influential in changing and amending those administrative directives to be more inclusive. One of the ways in which we just recently did that was we're changing some of the ways in which we do surveys. We're changing who's identified in represented in which boxes you can check for participation in the survey based on race, ethnicity, identification, all of those types of things. Those just give you some examples, Steve, of how we're trying to change those administrative directives to account for where we are right now.
That's good stuff. I want Jackie to comment on this. We have a question from Collins, Ebo, and Danny Hess that I want to get to, and then we'll quit after that. But Jackie, if you want to go real quick on this subject,
sure.
Please.
I'll just say that when we started this work, we did kind of a mini assessment of where we were at. And what we found is all of the departments had some policies or some approaches that they took that were related to DEI, but we didn't have this comprehensive approach to it, which is why we decided we need to start with our seed team. We need to create a framework, and our goal is to implement some equity tools that will prompt questions as we're developing programs, policies, and procedures to make sure that we have that equity lens as we're doing our work. So we're not there yet, but that is our goal, is to implement that. And there are lots of different tools out there that we're exploring.
I think a great name for an equity program could be "We're Not There Yet." And I don't know that would ever change. Collins, please go forward with your comment or question.
We're not there yet. That's the title of every PowerPoint presentation I give to.
Right, exactly.
Give me more money and justify my budget. So our community leaned pretty heavily in 2015 to President Obama's 21st century policing initiatives. So using technology, social media, community policing, crime reduction, and then internal officer wellness and safety, implementing PEWS. That's an acronym that I can't remember what it stands for now, but in cases of use of force, frequency, types of interactions with the public, and even maybe reported concerns amongst police officers, and a file might be activated for said officer to now meet with internal affairs or with a counselor. So that's one of the things that came out of this 21st century policing initiative. So my question to all of you, what's your current relationship with your local law enforcement? As the one that I just expressed seems to, come to us and say, hey, what can we do? I want to make sure that, and I'm new in my kind of position here as an interim director, I want to make sure that I'm still holding them accountable to some of those maybe scary in their eyes metrics, while recognizing the partnership and not signing off on maybe statements, joint statements to the community to assuage their concerns, or have a stamp of, hey, the DEI office or the Equity Human Rights Office said that what we did in the community is okay. So just a kind of a general question of what's your relationship like with your local law enforcement, and how are you able to continue to push them?
And I'll let Jackie handle this
yes,
one.
I'm
First,
enthusiastic about this one because I have a great relationship with my chief, and he's one of the first people that I collaborated with before we even started our initiative. And he happens to be a person of color. He's Vietnamese American, and I give him so much credit. Sunnyvale has a unique model. We have had since the beginning. So all of our police are also they're also trained in fire, and they're also EMTs. So we have this integrated model. If there's a fire incident, our police get there and they change into their fire uniform and they go in. So I also think that the culture of our department is slightly different, because people who come into our department, they're not just there to be law enforcement officers. They're there to be public safety officers. And that means, and they rotate often from police to fire, and they just serve in these roles. And I think that changes the culture of the department. But I also think my chief really, really focuses on culture and making sure when he hires the right people that are very community minded. And that is something that is continually emphasized in public safety. I won't say we don't have any problems, because we do, but at the same time, we had this really big revision of our internal affairs policies that is much more transparent. Any incident that has use of force is reviewed by our deputy chiefs. And there is an analysis about what happened. And it's funny because when we went around and we did our listening sessions with our community, we had a group of young people that were really riled up because they had an incident in a park where they felt like the police were a little too aggressive and rude, and they filed a complaint. And when we asked them, well, what happened? Oh, it was sustained. They were upset, but at the same time, because of our strong internal affairs process, they made a complaint and their complaint was sustained. We can't tell people that, what the disciplinary action was, because that's confidential, but the fact that it was sustained, I think said a lot about our department. And we have had incidents where I know in other communities, violent incidents would have resulted in death of a resident, and it hasn't. So I'm proud of the work. They are integral partners in this work. And on my seed team, I have one of the deputy chiefs is on my seed team, and a big champion of equity. And so I think they recognize that there's continual work that needs to happen. And I'll also say that, you know, there's also some hard conversations around transparency. They're very protective of, you know, police tends to be very protective of their staff and their reputation. And I had some difficult conversations. We created a transparency portal after our conversations with our community after the Black Lives Matter protests that happened in our city. And we created this more robust transparency portal. And it was a lot of pushing to get that data and information out. But, you know, we work really well together. And I think it's such an important partnership to have.
Thanks, Jackie. And we're at time, but I do want to get Danny's question and then we'll quit after that. But one quick thing to add, I would rely on your police department. They take a lot of bias training. It's part of their officer certification, and also your libraries. The National Library Association has some amazing training and information on this subject. So roping them in and saying, hey, what are you learning? What are you training is also a great way to engage them and also understand, and get them talking about it too. So it's a way that you can have them take their training and put it into a more proactive approach. So that's one thing I definitely recommend. So let's please go to Danny and then we'll end after that.
Thanks, Stephen. So we're lucky here in Bozeman to have top-down support from administration, from council. There's a good contingent in the community who is really happy to see the city doing equity work. But how would you advise staff when they're working with directors or council members or even members of the community who are really eager to just hitch their cause or their decision to sort of the equity bandwagon without really understanding what that looks like in implementation?
Yeah, that's a good
and
question.
how do you do that in a way that doesn't turn people away or call them out in a way that you know disrupts momentum of this good support for equity work?
I want Jonathan to speak on this, but I'm going to start by saying the first thing I always tell people is that this is not an overnight fix. You need to manage expectations up front, that this is not carnation instant equitability. You know, this is something that takes time. There's a process, and you not only find out what it means to me, but find out what it means to your community. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this?
You know, Danny, thank you for your question. I don't really have a good answer for you. The reason I say that, this is courageous conversations, right? And so sometimes the answer is we don't know. And I don't have a lot of advice for you because I know what you're experiencing, right? So equity has now become such a buzzword that's on everybody's tongue. And so we even have members from department directors who will use the term when they know whatever they're doing is not equity, to, you know, council people, you know, who think a certain thing is equity and it's not, right? I don't have a good answer for you how you course correct, other than continuing to try to make sure that you ingrain in people's minds the language that you think is necessary. How do you stop people from sort of co-opting things? Not sure. I think what I would also recommend in that domain is probably just get your message out early and often, you know, and try to ensure that your definition of what the thing is or what success looks like is actually from you all's department or division. And it's done in collaboration. The third thing I'll say is this: maybe the ways in which you can work together in partnership, and we've done this now, is instead of completely ceding the narrative to whomever that entity is, it is, hey, as joint collaborators, you know, this is what the result is, and this is what we do, and this is how it looks equity oriented and yada, yada, yada. But your voice is recognized on the same stage as theirs. And so you aren't then looked at as ancillary or taking a back seat to, you're looking at it as collaborators and not as, you know, them driving the bus on what the thing is.
I just want to chime in really quickly.
Please,
because
go
I see
ahead,
that a
Jacqueline.
lot about people throwing this equity work out. And my approach is always asking questions and really trying to dig deeper into what is going on. And then, I mean, I have the privilege of being an executive, so I can be more assertive in my assessment of what's happening and being able to push back. But my approach is always to question and be curious and really try to get at the root, because people have a good intent, right? They're trying to do something. But I'll also say part of that is education, right? You need to normalize conversations around race and equity, and part of that is having shared definitions and really having everyone in your organization understand that. I know with us, we started with our C team, but also with our executive leadership team. So we've started doing some trainings with our executive leadership team because we know we're rolling this initiative out organizationally. We're preparing to have citywide training where every single employee in the city is going to be required to take some equity training to, again, have this shared definition and understanding of what we're trying to do. But we don't want to surprise our department heads when they get questions from, you know, their own staff about what this is, and they're ill prepared for that. So I think part of it is that continuing education.
All
Yeah,
right.
that's great
Well,
feedback. Thanks, everyone.
yeah, thank you, Danny, for the question. Thank you, everybody. And as Laura mentioned in the comments, we'll post the other questions and comments we didn't get to on ICMA and go from there. But I just want to end by thanking Mark Ott, Executive Director of ICMA, for being a champion for these conversations, particularly Lynn Scott for her work at ICMA, Ray Bray, and last but certainly not least, our liaison for this session, Laura Savage, for doing a fabulous job setting this up and helping us. And of course, I would be remiss not to thank Jackie and Jonathan, who I've had the privilege to become friends with throughout these discussions, and really value their insight and their discussion. So thank you for everybody for taking the time to listen to us today. And I hope this was beneficial, and I hope you got a lot out of it. The conversations do not end here. We were talking privately in the chat. We could have talked all afternoon on this. As you can see, the three of us and many of you are very enthusiastic about this stuff. So thank you for everything. Thank you for being here. And for whatever the holidays mean for you, I wish you all the best. Laura, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you.
What a wonderful way to end this week and end this year. Again, email us at speakup@icma.org if you have extra questions. If you have an idea for the next courageous conversation or topic with equity officers or with someone else at ICMA, or if you're interested in participating in a courageous conversation, don't hesitate to reach out. And again, thank you for attending, and thank you for speaking and participating, Steve, Jackie, and Jonathan.